Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 7th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I can keep making it. And the way that we pay for the production and just all of the kind of background stuff that you don't see is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. We use the Patreon model. You can visit Patreon, patreon.com/talknerdy to learn how you can pledge on an episodic basis to offset that cost. Basically, you're supporting the show so that those who can't afford to do so will always have access and it won't ever be behind a paywall. All right. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right. So this week I had the opportunity to have a sit down with Dr. Helen King. You may have heard her on BBC Radio. She is Professor Emerita of Classical Studies at the Open University. She's also an elected member of the General Synod of the Church of England, where she's vice chair of Together, which campaigns on a range of discrimination issues, including discrimination on the grounds of gender or sexuality. She has a previous book called Hippocrates Women, and she writes all over the place about the history of women's health. She's got a new book out, and that's what we chat about today. It's called Immaculate Forms, A History of the Female Body in 4 parts. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Helen King. Well, Helen, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's lovely to be with you, Cara.
So we're going to be talking about your new book, Immaculate Forms, A History of the Female Body in 4 parts. And of course, based on that title, one might have many guesses as to how you approach this topic, as to what your background is. So let's get into that first. Would you consider yourself a classicist? Like what type of, you're a professor of classical studies, but what labels did you usually use in academia?
Sure, it's quite complicated. So my first degree was in ancient history with social anthropology. So I was always interested in comparative study between different societies. So I'm sort of a comparativist. I've more recently described myself mostly as a historian of the body or a historian of medicine. For a while, I was funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is the big funder for history of medicine in the UK. So I was very much a historian of medicine. And I think because the medicine I did was mostly looked at history of gynecology, obstetrics, and midwifery. So you could say historian of the female body, but of course that immediately raises questions about what's a female. So yeah, it's hard to label yourself, isn't it? But I think that's actually a healthy thing. I think it's good that I'm not just within one discipline. It's quite boring in one discipline, I think.
Oh, I completely agree. I'm curious how those interests sort of coalesced over the years. You have probably more broad training, and then of course we get to choose what topics we want to focus on for our theses or dissertations. But was this driven by a concern about the lack of access to published works in this area? Was it driven by a sort of personal kind of feminist drive, or how did you get to this place?
That's a really interesting question. So it's multiple drivers, I think. So one of the big drivers was my own body. I've always had, in my younger days, lots of problems, so ignore that last one. I'll start that answer again. I think there have been multiple drivers. So one of them is my own body. When I was growing up, I had all sorts of problems with periods and eventually got diagnosed with endometriosis, which traditionally takes about 10 years to get diagnosed. And it was probably more than that for me. So periods were kind of interesting to me. But I didn't think you could really study the history of menstruation. That seemed an odd thing to be doing because I'd done a degree in ancient history with all sorts of things, politics, military history, social history. No one really talked about women's bodies there. But for my PhD, I decided to write on ancient Greek concepts of time. And it didn't take many people saying to me, in the elevator at the Institute of Classical Studies, oh, so are you doing calendars? Are you doing clocks? And I realized I wasn't. I was doing life cycle. I was doing time as lived. So experience of growing up, really. And that's where the menstruation came in. So how did people think about women's bodies at the transitional point where you become a woman, you start to bleed, you get pregnant, you stop bleeding, you start again, you get to the menopause, you stop again. How did that work in the past? And I was very lucky because when I was starting out, there were two other people working in the United States on this. Monica Green, who at that point, I think was she at Arizona then, or anyway, she was the person who was doing history of the body through the sort of medical traditions of the ancient Greeks and Romans as experienced in the medieval period. So she was a
Oh,
medieval
wow.
person. Yeah, so she was using the same texts as me, but in a different social context in medieval Europe. And the other person was Leslie Dean Jones, who ended up at Austin. And Leslie was working on Aristotle, the philosopher Aristotle, and the Hippocratic medical texts, and comparing and contrasting them in terms of, again, women's bodies. So I was doing Hippocratic medical texts, but trying to set them in the context of other beliefs about bodies and being human. So looking at a much wider field of things like poetry and myth, the sorts of myths that are told around the goddesses, how they fit in with ideas about the female body. So we were all doing slightly different things, but we got together, and whenever anyone in our little group of three went to the other person's country, we'd have a chat, we'd go to the same conferences, we'd send each other examples of our work. This was all pre-computers, my goodness. So we'd actually print things out and send them airmail. Wow. But that meant we were all very much concerned with the same sorts of questions, but with slightly different approaches. So it was very lucky to be at a time when I wasn't the only person doing it.
It's
I think that
fascinating.
helped.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about the fact that as a historian, there is whether we're talking about these things being situated in time, which is the most kind of obvious parameter, or perspective, or any number of sort of qualifiers we can use when we describe a zeitgeist. You're steeped in the documentation, the literature, the examples of that era, but of course you yourself are living in the zeitgeist of today. And when we talk about women's health and women, this is not th- I shouldn't say it's a problem, but this is an area where there is still a lot of inequity and there's still a lot of difficulty and confusion. Like you mentioned, it takes 10 years plus to be diagnosed with endometriosis in 2025. So I'm curious, both you and your colleagues who are in this area, how often do those comparisons come about? How often does your frame, I guess, sort of superimpose on the historical frame and vice versa?
I think it took me personally quite a long time to realize that connection. I was almost doing ancient Greek theories of menstruation as a way to escape from my own time, to think about an era where everything was seen differently, where your periods had to be regular and heavy, because that was what you were. You were a woman, you had wet, spongy flesh, you absorbed more fluid from your diet, you had to get rid of this blood, otherwise you'd die. And that was quite reassuring when I was having very heavy periods to think about it in ancient Greek terms. So I was actually using it as a sort of escapism.
Oh,
And
fascinating.
it came later, really, that realization that looking at what happened in the past illuminates what's happening in the present and helps you to think through some of the crazy ideas that people put forward now, in terms of the equally crazy ideas, but maybe different ideas in the past. So yeah, it was not deliberately a feminist enterprise when I started, but it became one.
I think about, I've been doing the podcast now for about 10 years, a little over, maybe 11 years now. This is episode 545. And it's sometimes hard for me to remember every, interview I've done, every book that I've covered. But one that comes to mind in a striking way is Angela Saini's book. I always mix up the two that she did, Inferior and Superior, because one is
Yes,
about race and one
yes.
is about
And what
gender.
about gender? That's right.
But she talks quite a bit about, the gender differences in medical treatment and in just scientific inquiry, like biomedical scientific inquiry. And I also think about another author that I had on the show who writes quite a lot, I think for the New York Times, or it might be the Washington Post, about women's health. Who she was on the show right around when I had my hysterectomy, and so we did some really deep dives into the pudendum, right, and these shame terminology, and so I've talked about this issue in the past, but never in I guess I could say a classics kind of approach, like looking to the ancients and then forward. And also your approach is that you take this in 4 parts in the book. So what brought you to those 4 parts, and maybe you can help us understand what they are?
Sure. So I went from breasts, clitoris, hymen, womb, and that was deliberate because I started off with lots more parts. I had things like hair and voice, anything that's been used to say you're a woman, you're not a woman. But it became obvious I couldn't do all that in a book. It was already getting too long. So I focused on those as the sort of sexualized parts and the gendered parts, because it struck me that actually they were not as gendered as they might look. For example, men have breast tissue, can get breast cancer. It's not just a girl thing to have breasts. And of course, you don't have to have breasts to be a woman. So it struck me that these were very interesting parts in terms of how gendered they really are and the different sorts of ways people have imagined them over history. So, breasts, you can't necessarily see them, but you often get a hint of them through clothing, sometimes more than a hint. Think uplift bras. But then when you move to clitoris, hymen, and womb, you're going further and further inside the body. And before the era of imaging, people had no idea, obviously, what was going on in there. So imagination became a big thing. So you're moving from what you see and think you understand to what you can't see and you have to imagine. And that movement struck me as a very interesting one to focus on because once you get to the womb, we're talking about something which people had no idea what was going on. You could see it gets bigger when you're pregnant. That was about it, really. So, how big is it when you're not pregnant? No idea. You could possibly see the womb if someone suffers from a prolapse, because you can have a partial prolapse where you can just see a bit of the womb outside the body, or a really disastrous thing, full prolapse, where the womb is so weak, the whole thing comes out of the body. And that must have been more common in the past because it happens as a result of multiple childbearing. So they would have known something about what the womb looked like. But how it did what it did, how did it make a baby? How does that possibly work? Does the woman contribute something? Is it just the man planting his seed and the woman is like a field and the field helps it grow? Does the man provide, this is Aristotle, man provides the shape and woman provides the blood, which is the raw material that makes the baby? Lots of different ideas there. But at the same time, because you can't see the womb, it's both a sort of strange, nasty place where evil stuff happens. It's not a nice place at all. It's sort of dark and sinister. But it's also positive because without it, you wouldn't have another generation. And it's been praised widely from the ancient world onwards as having extraordinary powers to contain, to expel, to shape. So, because you can't see it, you go through a whole series of imaginings. And I think that's again very fertile, if you'll pardon the pun, very fertile way of looking at the body. How do you imagine? How do you imagine the body when you can't see what's actually going on? That tells you a lot about a culture.
Oh, it absolutely does, and I can't help but think about the lack of knowledge in, modern men.
Mm,
When you see these videos on the internet where men are quizzed about, what is a, ovary, or, where in the body is it? I mean, I remember dating somebody after my first colposcopy. This is a man who had a PhD, not in biology, but in, physics, and he didn't know exactly where the cervix was, and so I was a little
yeah.
concerned about that.
Yeah, well, even the clitoris is a complete classic. I talk in the book about the interesting issue of where people thought the clitoris was. And to read medieval texts saying that it's actually in the entrance to the vagina,
Mm.
what? What do you think is going on there? And then, where's the hymen? Assuming we even believe in the hymen, and that's
Mhm.
another whole topic. But if you have a hymen, where is it? Is it sort of right on the outside, or is it actually up where the cervix is? Is it at the top of the vagina, at the entrance to the womb? What is going on there? Because they have to know that wombs don't just let things out. They may let out menstrual blood and they eventually let out a baby, but most of the time they're quite good at holding things in there. So what do? Do they close up? Is there like a door?
Mm.
Is that what it is? You get descriptions of these parts as the womb gate, the idea there's sort of gates that open and close. And it's a whole new world in there. The womb gate is like a city with its own entrance system. It's an extremely wild world in there.
Oh gosh, there's so many angles that I want to approach here. I think one that comes to mind is I mentioned that author that I had on the show. Now it would be 2, 3 years ago when I had my hysterectomy. I didn't say her name, Rachel Gross, and
Yeah, I thought it
we,
might be Rachel. Yeah,
yeah,
we are in
yeah.
touch. We are in touch.
And we spoke a bit about this concept of I don't know, it speaks to exactly what you mentioned, how as you broke down these 4 parts, you were going kind of deeper into the body, into the sort of unknown or the abyss, as it were. And we talked quite a bit about, I had cervical cancer. You just told me that you had endometriosis. These are 2 things that we cannot see and we cannot know
Yes,
without modern medicine and without specific types of tests to be able to see it, and sometimes just surgical techniques, right? Pathology from surgical
right.
techniques. um, but I remember at the time, this was against the era of like Roe v. Wade being overturned here in the United States. Like, I think I was diagnosed the week of the SCOTUS leak, and then I actually had the surgery the week of the law being overturned, which was,
Wow.
what is even happening? And at the time, in an effort to be inclusive, so this takes us back to an earlier moment in our discussion, which I want to spend a little bit of time in, which is categorization, constructs, the idea of what it means to be a woman, what is gender really. At the time, in an effort to be inclusive, which I fully support, right? I fully want to ensure that like my trans and non-binary friends and family are included when we talk about gender. There was a switch of language that out here in the public media, and they started to say people with a uterus, and I was like, well, but now
Mm,
I'm excluded.
exactly.
You know what I
Exactly.
mean? So it's like it's so hard to categorize and to be like, what does it mean to be a woman or a female, have a female body,
Well, I've had a hysterectomy, so yeah, I'm not people with a uterus either. But
right?
I'm quite pleased about that because people with a uterus may well need all sorts of tests that I don't need. So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
happy not to be involved in that one. But yeah, exactly. So the uterus thing, that's quite easy. You've got one or you haven't. But then do you know whether you've got one? One of the things I look at in the book, as you'll know, is the whole question of intersex, hermaphrodite, people with disorders of sexual development, differences in sexual development. The fact we haven't even got a label that we all agree on is interesting. But let's some people with this condition would say that it's fine to say intersex. I'm going to use it because it's the shortest. So people who are intersex may well not have a uterus. They may well be, as far as they can tell, female. They've been brought up a female. They've been assigned female at birth. They have breasts. They look female. They feel female. They're female, right? But they don't have a uterus. And they don't know that until they try to get pregnant. And people start doing tests and then go, hang on a minute, that's why you can't get pregnant. Now, that to me is something that really undoes all the binaries. And it's interesting in the book, I look at 19th century cases where people didn't have a womb, although outside they were definitely female and they felt female. And there's quite a lot of discussion in the 19th century about this because it starts off as being something to do with dissection. Until you do a lot of autopsies, you don't find that people are not a perfect match. Their insides and their outsides don't match. Once you get imaging and also the possibility of doing a laparotomy on someone and having a look, then you can start saying, okay, this person is still alive and doesn't fit. So what are they? Do you say to someone who doesn't have a womb, well, sorry, wombs are essential for being a woman, so you're not a woman anymore? You can't do that. Someone's been brought up a woman, they feel a woman, they're a woman. So there, people with a uterus, there's people who don't have a uterus, but are quite clearly female, have never had a uterus, never will have a uterus. It's not all about the womb. But then against that, you've got the history of the idea that basically women are wombs. I quote a 19th century writer talking about it's as if God had created the womb and then built up a woman around it. They're so
Right.
fundamental that being a woman is utterly irrelevant. It's just all about the womb. You're just a carrier for this thing.
Hmm.
That's a bizarre image too, isn't it? You're just carrying a womb through life because that's all you've got
Ugh.
it for. It's gross. It's
It is
gross.
gross.
So
Yeah, it does not sit well with me at all.
no, it's really uncomfortable. But then what do you do if someone doesn't have breasts? Well, you say you've still got breast tissue because both men and women have breast tissue. You may not have anything particularly, you know, to boast about there in a culture which likes large breasts. But then, do we like large breasts? That's another question. I talk a bit in the book about some of the 18th century ideas about what sort of breasts are best, and it's not big ones. There, big ones are regarded as not good for breastfeeding. So again, it's back to having children, isn't it? It's always back to that. So big ones, the milk will be too cold. It won't feed the baby properly. So, because there's this whole heat cold thing that goes from the ancient Greeks onwards that men are hot, women are cold. Men are hot enough to cook their blood into semen, which is clearly the most superior fluid in the human
I
body
see. Yes, of course.
by definition. So women can't do that. They can't cook it enough. But large breasts are also cooling down your blood and cooling down the milk that is made from blood. It's the same fluid in most of Western medical theory. So large breasts are bad because they're no good for feeding babies.
It's so funny how wrong they got that too, that, like, actually testicles are cooler than the rest of the body. That's so funny.
Yeah, it's a classic, isn't it? So hot is good because clearly when you're cold, you're dead, right? So cold
Right.
has to be the negative one. So yeah, binaries, eh? They really are quite something.
They are, and when I think back to, like, Hippocrates, when I think back to these sort of ancient texts, I'm curious how often would an intersex individual or somebody who doesn't quite fit the gender binary have been discussed or even understood? Were they doing a lot of autopsies then? Would they have even
Yeah, they
discovered these
weren't.
things?
No, they
Okay,
don't do
okay.
autopsy. So this is one of the weird things about ancient Greek medicine that no one ever seems to get, that they very, very rarely did human dissection. There was a period in the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria in Egypt where a couple of Greek doctors did do dissections. And although their work doesn't survive in full, the quotations we have from it show that they did very well on finding bits of the body that people hadn't really thought about before. So, like even the duodenum is described in detail. It wasn't a part that really had been mentioned before. And they wondered about bodies when it comes to reproduction. In the 3rd century BCE, they decided that actually men and women both had testicles. I assume what they were looking at in women was the ovaries, but
Right,
they thought they
yes.
must be like testicles in men. So both men and women produced seed, and the seed came together and mixed to make a baby.
Hey, that's
So they
pretty
were very
good for the
keen.
time. Yeah.
It's not bad, is it? It's
No,
really
it's
not
not.
bad at all. It
Yeah.
certainly beats the idea that the man plants his seed and the woman is just a field that grows it.
Right, right.
So, yeah, so they had ideas there, but they were not doing dissections on a regular basis. And they were doing it very much for knowledge of the body. But then, in terms of whether you find someone who's intersex there's no evidence that they did with the dissection work. But a century or two before that, in the Hippocratic texts, there is a description of a woman called Phaethusa from Abdera, who, when her husband leaves her, suddenly stops menstruating. and has all sorts of symptoms like growing body hair and a beard and her voice deepening. And this seems to suggest that unless you are a married woman, you can't sustain a female body. Somehow a woman needs a
Interesting.
man to be a woman.
Were they describing
So yeah,
menopause, do you think?
that's quite something, isn't it?
It is. Do you think that they were describing menopause at the time? Is that what they were actually observing?
It's so hard to know, Cara. I really
Yeah,
wish I
yeah.
did. I mean, she's definitely had children. It says that she'd had children before the husband left. Um, it's possible that it's menopause. It's possible that it's some sort of tumor that's producing
Mm,
hormone.
yeah.
The way they see it is very much that without a man, you can't be a proper woman.
Right.
Um, but all the way through, they describe her as she. That's interesting. So even though she's not doing the things her body should, and she's growing a beard and so on, she's still she.
Yeah. Yeah, that is
This isn't sex
interesting.
change. It's
Mhm.
a weird thing that can happen to women. And the story then goes on that there's another woman who had this. So the writer claims to have seen two women with this condition. And that's almost like saying, well, look, it's not just a one-off. Another woman could have this, anyone could have it. So, women, hold on to your husband, because without him, you too could start growing a beard.
Right. How common was it in these ancient texts to come across examples then, maybe not so much of intersex, of sort of biological differences, but of social cultural differences? Because we know that, trans experiences, that's not a new phenomenon, right? Individuals through all cultures
Right.
and all times have had either gender dysphoria or gender differences in sort of their own
Yes.
gender identity. What were the examples that you came across when we talk about, like, quite ancient texts?
One of the things that is clear in the ancient texts is that they do believe that you can change sex completely, that your
Hmm.
body changes sex, but only
Mm.
one way. You always change towards the male because the male is the superior.
Of course.
Of course, you knew that was coming. So it's not just that there are stories in myth of characters who change. So there's a woman called Kainis who changes to being a man after an attempted rape by a god. Well, there's a good motive to change towards being a
Jeez.
man.
Yeah.
So, she's completely safe after that, I hope. Maybe not. So there's an example from myth, but also there are stories in writers like Pliny, who's in his natural history describes all sorts of things about the body and the weirdness of the body. And he talks about sex change, but he says, I've seen it myself. So it's not put in the realm of myth, it's put in the realm of actual historical fact that an individual can change sex. Now, what that is clearly not the same thing as trans. It's not about you feeling that you are definitely the wrong sex in some way. It's about your body making a sudden shift, usually around puberty or sometimes on the eve of marriage. It's a good time to do it, isn't it, really? You're a girl, you're about to get married, and suddenly testicles and a penis pop out.
Right.
That's a story that then gets retold and retold through the early modern period. It's goes in texts that discuss other things like werewolves, the idea that you can be between human and animal. So it's about breaking down binaries, I think. Binaries that everyone assumes are there, but then in certain circumstances, you can shift. But that should mean it's more possible for somebody who wants to live in a sex other than the one they were assigned at birth to do so, because it's breaking down binaries.
It makes me wonder about the idea of so much of this is informed by patriarchal, superior, like male superiority, right? And so everything is sort of like the normative is male and the other is female. But it makes me wonder about practices like what they would call eunuchs, I guess at the time, like castrated men who I guess then they're still considered men. They're not considered, feminine or female. They're just considered a different kind of man.
Or they can be a third sex.
Mhm.
They can be
Okay.
something that's somehow out of the whole binary. It's just moved into a different category. And one of the reasons for creating eunuchs is because you don't want them to reproduce. So therefore, they are somehow safer They're not going to try to take over your power, to install their own family on your throne, because they don't have a family. So they're outside. They've moved out of the normal competition for power into another place. But that's a place which can give them power, of course.
Right. And of course, there's this assumption that women, by their virtue or by their nature, can't or won't or don't hold on to power. That's not a woman's place. A woman's place is to be the womb. Did you see examples? I mean, there's always examples that fly in the face of what we think of as normative. But as you were studying these classical texts about the female form, did you see examples that sort of turn that on its ear? Or was it pretty much like, yeah, like a woman's a womb?
I think a woman's a womb, really.
Yeah, yeah.
That's basically it. And if you aren't, there's something a bit wrong with you.
Mm,
Uh, so if you stepped outside the expectations for your gender, for your sex, you are by definition a bit odd, and that might mean that you are successful in a particular field. I mean, it's a totally different historical period, but think of someone like Joan of Arc, who really plays on the whole virgin image, and is therefore can be a warrior in a way that a woman who was married with children could not be a warrior. So you can do things by stepping outside. And of course, if we're talking about stepping outside of expectations, we are rapidly moving into Christianity and the Virgin Mary, who's Virgin and Mother. How do you manage that?
mm.
There's someone who's breaking down some binaries within uh, the category of woman in
Oh,
a way
yeah.
which, again, it is echoed by other women in history, women who uh, are both virgin and producers of milk, for example. I talk in the book about a 15th century real woman from Bologna, Elena Duglioli, who was married but refused to have sex with her husband, and which was quite normal in some sort of elite marriages, that you didn't do the sex thing. And that was okay. And she then started to produce breast milk, which, how do you do that when you've not only never been pregnant, you've never even had sex?
Oh, yeah, you must have some sort of endocrine disorder.
Well, exactly. So it's got to be
Yeah.
some sort of, yeah, it's got to be some sort of tumor which is
Mhm.
producing the hormones. But of course, her interpretation of that was that it was fine, because that's the sort of thing you're talking about with the Virgin Mary, seen in images breastfeeding her baby, but a virgin. So it was fine. So that meant that Eleanor Duglioli's milk became a sacred fluid, and the stories of her life are full of assorted ecclesiastical men coming to drink from her body.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
I know. So sometimes, from their hand, she expresses milk, they drink it. But there's one particular guy who's her sort of spiritual advisor who takes it direct. And that to us is extremely weird.
Yeah.
It's
Wow, what a
really,
strange
we've moved
kink.
into,
Yeah.
the really, really weird area. But then her body goes on being even weirder. So even after death, she continues to produce breast milk. So
Mm.
now we're talking taking breast milk from a corpse.
Wow. Wow, and this is all documented.
This is documented. Now, we don't know what on earth's going on with her body. As you say, it's got to be some sort of tumour that's doing
Mm.
this.
Mhm.
But, whoa, it just shows that the difference between us and them in terms of what we think is normal, what we think is yucky
Yeah.
and really,
Yeah.
really weird. But then you look at the history of breast milk in medicine, and the idea that breast milk cures disease is still all over the internet,
Mhm.
usually for things like conjunctivitis, various eye conditions. If you apply breast milk, this will cure it, allegedly.
Right.
Quite. But then, if you look at 17th, 18th century medical texts, there you are talking about taking milk for abdominal conditions, all sorts of things. And again, the question of, do you take it direct from a woman, or do you take it after it's been expressed by that woman? Because
Wow.
surely it's better to go right to the source, isn't it? You know,
Jeez.
kind of makes sense. So it's fascinating to me how things that we find really weird were considered completely normal, and vice versa. I mean, one of the reviews of the book commented about how it really is sort of a collection of amazing anecdotes and trivia. but that the trivia themselves tell a story.
Hmm.
The sheer range of weirdness that people have about the female body and about what counts as a woman and what you can do with a woman's body and what it should look like, what it should do, that's telling us something. And it's telling us that our idea that somehow everything's really strange at the moment and gosh, bodies are difficult and complicated, they've always been like that. There
Yeah.
isn't some golden age where we all agreed on what bodies do and what they should look like. Never, never, never.
Well, and what's fascinating is that they've always been subject in a really fundamental way to the male gaze. And so when I think about your four parts, we've got breasts and uteri, and of course breasts and the uterus is from the male gaze, these things are about life. They're about producing life and sustaining life. But then you also talk, as you mentioned, about the hymen and about the clitoris. So the hymen, and I guess, talk to us about this, but this is about virginity. This is about purity from a male gaze perspective. This is about youthfulness. And then the clitoris is super confusing because what is a guy, if we're really talking about the male gaze, why do they even care?
Well, exactly. So, okay, we'll start with the clitoris. So, they might care because they believe it's essential to conception. The
Mm.
clitoris and the womb have a connection historically because some people believed that you couldn't conceive unless the woman had experienced pleasure because she had to release her female seed. It's back to that again. And just as men's seed requires pleasure to release it, so woman's seed must require pleasure. Where is this seed? Well, it's obviously not coming out in the way that a man's seed is, although, let's bracket out there female ejaculation, which is obviously another topic that we could get into. But the idea was that women are somehow ejaculating their seed when they feel pleasure, but they're doing it into the womb, direct into the womb. So their seed can meet the man's seed and whatever. So it might be really important. In some points in history, it has been important to say that women must have pleasure, otherwise you won't conceive. But the hymen, very weird. That's one where you go through, does a historical group believe in this or not? And whereas with the clitoris, they're very open, 16th century dissectors, the early anatomists of that period, say things like, well, there's supposed to be this clitoris thing, but I can't find one. I think it's just some weird freak that some women have. And then they're also looking for the hymen and going, well, I can't find that either. Is that because all women have actually lost their virginity, at an early age? What am I going to do to find a hymen? And you have 16th century anatomists saying, well, nuns, they're a good idea. Women who've gone into a convent, surely they'll have
Oh.
hymens. So let's find a dead nun. It's quite extraordinary. And even then, doesn't mean that they've got one. And then they also try this, and this is, I'm afraid, content alert here. They also try this on children. So let's
Yeah.
find a really young girl and
Hmm.
let's see if she's got a hymen, because surely she'll have one.
Right.
And again, you get medical men saying, yes, I've seen one. I definitely saw one. I was, with the following short list of other medical men when we saw it. And you've got others saying, no, no such thing. So actually, both the clitoris and the hymen go through a does it exist, does it not exist crisis. But the
Do
hymen,
we?
of course, the hymen's different, of course, because it also is about how you become a woman and whether you are a full woman if you've still got one.
Oh, see, this is the confusing part for me. Like, where did the concept of the hymen even begin? Like the clitoris, I get because it's there throughout the lifespan and it's a very obvious thing. The hymen is like, come on, like, okay, I guess technically there is a thing called the hymen, this like small piece of tissue that's technically there early, like, but it goes away on its own very often. It
Yes,
doesn't have to
exactly.
go away from sex. So just from like growth and living
Yeah.
life, it goes away from activity. So like, where did the idea of the hymen even first come into play? Did you go back that far?
Yes. So I looked at that, and there is a lot of argument that actually this is an ancient Greek thing, but it isn't. The word hymen is ancient Greek, yes. Hymen just means membrane. And ancient Greek medical texts talk about all sorts of membranes, in the eye, in the heart, anything that's just a membrane. They don't talk about a membrane down below at all. That's just not there. But they do talk about bleeding at first intercourse. Now, if you're going to say, well, what's this bleeding caused by? You can say, well, okay, something's broken. And then you can sort of move into the idea of a hymen. But you can also say, well, it's just from the pressure, the irritation of the
Totally. It
sexual
could be
act.
from trauma. Yeah, I used to
Particularly,
when I still
yeah,
had a cervix, I bled all the time from sex. That was a very common experience
yeah,
for me.
it
Because cervixes
happens. It
bleed.
happens.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about a culture in which the ideal is to marry a girl when she's 13, so in the
Mhm.
14th year is what they all say, and that the husband will be considerably older than that, he may well not be taking much care. He may well cause bleeding. You
Yeah.
can have bleeding anyway, but in a situation where someone much older than you is having sex with you, who has someone who's got sexual experience, perhaps with prostitutes,
Mhm.
with sex workers, and he's having sex with you, and you are terrified and you've got no idea what's going on, it's not exactly unexpected that there'd be some bleeding.
Right.
But it doesn't prove anything. That's the other problem. Of course, the absence of bleeding does not prove that you've had sex before. Bleeding is not a
Right.
guarantee that you are a virgin. So that's something again which has been acknowledged in the history of medicine. But they've tried to get around it by saying, well, some women they have a hymen, but it's kind of extra stretchy, so a man can get past it. So you've still got one.
The motivated reasoning, like, we'll just make up whatever narrative we need to make. We want her to be evil
Yeah,
and impure. We'll say that she definitely doesn't have one. We want her to be virginal, and I want to, brag about her to my friends. Well, yeah, she just has a very stretchy hymen.
yeah, extra stretchy ones. That's what it's all about.
Ugh,
And you also have a condition called imperforate hymen, which is a genuine medical condition where you have a very thick membrane there. And that is a very bad thing to have because it means that menstrual blood will build up behind this barrier and will obviously cause all sorts of problems. So, unless you can actually open up the barrier and let that blood out, you are at very serious medical risk. So, they're aware of that. Again, it's not very common, but they're aware of that in the history of medicine in the earliest periods, actually. So, they do know something about very large, very tough hymens, but that still doesn't stop them thinking about must be a hymen of some sort in every woman. Whereas we would say, actually, no, sometimes it's so minor you don't even notice it. And it can be broken, by other means. The classics in our era have been, horse riding. In the 19th century, it was bicycles. Don't ride a bicycle because it'll take your hymen, and no one will ever
right.
believe you're a virgin. And there's that thing there about no one will ever believe you're a virgin. Hello,
Mm-hmm.
can we just take women's word for these things?
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep. Yep.
No,
Yep.
clearly not.
That's oh God, again, it's like I often talk about the patriarchy like it's the water we swim in. That very often when I'm talking, especially to men, and they're not recognizing the fact that it is literally always around us everywhere, that this male gaze is the experience of being a woman is to constantly be subjected to the male gaze, that even the things that we don't think of as being gendered in that way deeply are. I remember being at a conference once and talking about turning our ideas of gender on its ear. And, I was on a panel or something. And I mentioned how I went to the gym. I've mentioned this on the show before. So apologies, everyone listening, if you've heard this before. But I was at the gym and there was a poster of the musculature, and it said the human musculoskeletal system. And then next to it, there was a woman and her musculature, and it said the female musculoskeletal system. I was
Oh,
like, well,
love
why
it.
doesn't that one
Love
say
it.
male? And
Of
so we were
course.
talking. You're right. We're talking about this idea of normative and other and bathroom. I love this example that I sort of came up with it on the spot. Bathroom signs. Why is the male just look like a person, but then the female looks like she's wearing a skirt? And it stumped the audience. So many people were like, well, what would you recommend otherwise? And I was like, maybe the woman looks like a person and the male has a mustache. I don't know. Like, why is the defining thing the thing that makes us other? And you see this so often throughout history that I'm curious, as you're digging and doing this incredible work to, this incredible research to be able to put this book together. Everything is through the male gaze. We are just wombs. We
Yes.
are, just
Yes.
versions. Did you find examples where women of the era, even if something was presented through the male gaze, was able to find empowerment in a perspective and kind of turn it on its ear?
Yes, there certainly are little moments there. They're
Mm,
often quite little, but they're
mhm,
exciting when you find them. So even things like the story of Eve. So the first woman, obviously bad thing, she is the one who offers the apple to Adam. She's the one who breaks God's law. She's the one responsible for the fall, for the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, all that. But then you also get women writing, and some men too, let's be fair, saying, actually, no, Eve had the right idea. She wanted knowledge. Knowledge is good. God says, this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve says, knowledge. I like the sound of that. Let's eat one of
mhm.
those apples. So she becomes a heroine. She becomes a seeker of the truth and not the evil one who leads everybody else astray. I like that. So there are little
Yeah,
moments like that that come through. There's moments where women writing about medicine manage to say something rather more constructive. So in the 19th century, a lot of women in America, particularly, wrote self help books for women. So, guides to being a young girl, to being a married woman, which were actually sometimes quite sensible. Instead of saying, your body has to look like this, they would say, well, there's quite a lot of variation in how your body looks. You could look like this, but some women look like that. So, those sorts of things, rather than saying, your labia have to look like this, and this is the only normal thing. So, a little bit of variation, a little bit of actually women talking to women and saying, you don't have to follow this narrow identity of
I
what a
love
woman's
that.
body should be like.
I love
So I think,
that.
yeah, I think that's encouraging. And it's not what you expect to find necessarily. It doesn't mean that they went down very well. I mean, there are examples of women who then gave lectures about what the female body is like and what it's capable of, and even included diagrams with the clitoris labeled, my goodness, so that people knew where it was. And they would give public lectures, sometimes to men and to women. The local press would say, this is disgusting, shouldn't be allowed, and so on. So it doesn't mean that they always did well as a result of coming out with this information, but they were trying. It's good.
It brings me to an interesting question. I guess this is kind of a two-part question, or I'm not sure which I wanna ask first, so I'll ask them both and take it however you like. But I think about the female form, both historically and in modern times, through this sort of male gaze that we often experience being the object, not the subject of the sentence, right? Of the
Right,
thought. And as the object, there's this sort of ambivalence towards the female form where we often hear about both sort of a goddess like worship, like a sexual drive, an interest and appetite, but also a disgust, ooh, that part is yucky and dark and wet and weird, right? And so you have this
right.
strange juxtaposition of hunger and disgust. But then the second part of that question, and that's not really a question, but I'm just mostly curious what the literature kind of showed on that. But the second part of that is this idea of women who love the female form, women who are sexually attracted to women, gay women, lesbians of the era. How did society treat them? Were they sort of like witches? Were they sort of like, you go do your thing in the corner and we don't care because you're not important to us? Was it something that was celebrated as sexy? Like how was that, handled?
Yeah. So I think, ooh, there's two big questions there. So the
Right.
first one, the first one, okay, just take me back to the first one. The first one is about
Yeah, the juxtaposition of like, you're so hot, but also you're gross.
you're gross at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely that. So you can admire the womb, as in, wow, it's incredible. It can expel all this material. Then what do you do about the material? So you can say, well, the material it's expelling is blood because blood is good. Blood makes babies. Blood is the raw material, so it must be good blood. But then you can also say, actually, no, it's being expelled. That's like urine and feces, so it must be bad blood. It might be not real blood. It's sort of blood-like, but it's not actual blood. And you try and sort of have two different fluids there, sort of good blood that makes babies and bad blood that has to be expelled. And the fact it's actually it's all the same menstrual blood, you try not to look at. So you try and sort of create binaries.
Yeah, but we even see it that way now. Like, I think a lot of people see it that way now.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, yes, in terms of menstrual blood, as in is that normal? Is it like real blood or is it funny blood? That's definitely still there. So for the ancient world, it's all blood, but it depends, yeah, what it's doing, whether you like it. If it's making a baby, it's good blood. If it's coming out of the body, it's bad blood. So they try and keep both beliefs at the same time. And it's the same with breasts. So breasts are both sexy, wow, good, and maternal, yes, which isn't sexy. But do you
Mhm.
try and keep those two functions apart? I spend quite a lot of the chapter on breasts thinking about that and whether you actually can separate the sexual aspect from the maternal aspect. So is it only when a breast is producing milk that it becomes maternal and then you're not supposed to be excited by it? Is that the way it works? And what sort of excitement are we talking here? So I have a quote from Samuel Pepys, who in his diary talks about um, going down to the local bar, and having much fun, sort of playing with various women who were down there and playing with their breasts. She's like, okay, that's the sort of thing you do, is it? But I've also got a quote from Charles Darwin talking about the look on a baby's face when it's breastfeeding, the look of absolute pleasure.
So there are probably situations though where the maternal aspect is what is sexually appealing, right?
Right. Obviously, something like adult breastfeeding today, as a
Right.
particular sexual kink. But there was a recent-ish saga in the British press about breast milk ice cream.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, so this was being marketed and sold in London, and the amount of horror there was extraordinary. It's like, okay, breast milk, wonderful stuff, great for babies. We all love breast milk, full of colostrum, gives you immunity, etc., etc. But breast milk for adults in ice cream, absolutely no.
Mm.
Real horror. And you think,
Mhm.
actually, what's going on there?
Right.
Because it's not like you're taking it direct from the breast, for goodness sake. You are using a product which you're happy to take as a baby, but somehow it's not okay as an adult.
Right,
I
and it's
find
probably
that
pasteurized as an adult. They're probably actually making it cleaner.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It probably is, yes.
Yeah.
And I found that quite odd. But people who tasted it said it didn't taste very nice. But again, is that because you're expecting it to not taste very nice because of what it is? I don't know if
Right.
they did a blind tasting, what do you think of this ice cream? So it's fascinating to me that line is still there. You can't think about adults and breast milk without saying either it's a sexual kink, which is, between consenting adults, fine, but we don't want to think about it, or the ice cream thing, just no.
Yeah. So I guess to the second question that I asked, how often did you come across writings about sort of lesbian sexual experiences or the female form through the female gaze?
Yes, so you don't really get a lot of that in the ancient world. The classic, of course, is Sappho. Now, Sappho of Lesbos, yes, Lesbos, so origin of the term lesbian. Lesbos, we don't honestly know with Sappho quite what was going on because we only have fragments of her poems and various people writing about her later. But she does talk about the clitoris, it seems to me, and not just to me, I'm not making this up, honestly. She talks about the sweet apple at the top of the tree, and
Mm.
the men picking the apples can't quite reach it. But it's the sweetest of all. That has to be a clitoral reference.
Right.
The apples, the redness, the roundness, it's got to be, hasn't it? So there
Absolutely.
you'd be suggesting there that actually only women can really find pleasure with other women. Similarly, in 1559, the key year in the history of the clitoris, when an anatomist called Realdo Colombo announces he's discovered the clitoris, this is a great moment in in the history of medical texts. I actually remember showing the text with this in to my students in the rare books room at the library where I was working, and they're like, whoa, this is it, the moment. Well, it isn't the moment, really, because there's plenty of references to the clitoris before that, but he is making himself out to be, the great discoverer, because obviously only
Yeah.
men can do discovering. And he says, well, there's this little oblong part of the body, and if you touch it, even with your little finger, the woman goes wild with pleasure and she sends seed flying out in all directions. It's that female seed thing again. So if you touch it with your little finger, the fear there appears to be that you don't need a man. You could do it
Right.
with your own little finger or another woman's little finger. Anyone could give
Hmm.
pleasure through the clitoris. So the little things like that, which suggest awareness that this is a perfectly possible thing, that a woman will pleasure another woman, but also unease, because that's not right, is it? That's not what it
Right.
should be. Where did men go in that? Oh dear, they're totally irrelevant.
Right. Except then it evolves into this like treatment, I suppose, for like
Hmm.
hysteria in later years, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, how I long to be living in an era where I could go to the doctor because I was quite tired and they would give me like cocaine and an orgasm.
Well, dream on.
Right.
But of course, the worry there is that they could also decide what you needed was a clitoridectomy.
Ooh, yeah, I
So
didn't think about
once,
the other side of
yeah,
that.
so be very careful there, Kara.
Ugh.
So the issue there is that because the clitoris, from time to time gets to be seen as really important, at other times it's seen as utterly irrelevant, not worth labeling on a medical textbook page. But anyway, when it's important, and it comes and goes, you get a situation where anything can be attributed to the clitoris. So hysteria, you've mentioned, there's one example, but also hemorrhoids,
Hmm.
digestive problems, just being a bit awkward.
Yeah.
All of those.
Autism. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It's
Not being able to
fascinating.
read very well, that's another one.
Right.
Illiteracy, not doing the housework very effectively. Any
Oh,
of these
jeez.
things could, in the 19th century, be attributed to your clitoris. And the answer was to remove it.
Oh, no, which now we just blame girls', periods for anything that we want to blame a woman for. "Oh, she must be on her period."
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But that's probably a lot safer than, oh, it's her clitoris, because then you're talking surgery. And
Yeah. Oh,
okay, what they're
god.
removing, there's again, that's the issue with the clitoris, is it just a little tiny button? Or is it obviously a bigger structure? And we now know it's a bigger structure, which
Right.
extends and actually wraps around the vagina. So the whole distinction between vaginal and clitoral orgasms is rubbish, because the vaginal orgasm is involving a clitoris and vice
Mm.
versa. It's one
Mhm.
thing. So if you're going to say, well, what we need to do is remove this clitoris, how much do you remove? If you're just removing the small external bit, that is not as big, obviously, as some more serious operation. But again, it comes and goes in history. So in the middle of the 19th century, it was known that the extent of the clitoris was much, much bigger than just the little bit that you can see. But nevertheless, they were doing clitoridectomy. And even in the ancient world, there are descriptions in surgical texts of how to do it, and they are pretty gross, involving a pair of scissors.
Oh,
But
god.
there they were doing it because they thought the clitoris was too large. Whereas in the 19th century, they're doing it because it's just the clitoris, just get rid of the whole thing. So there is a shift there in terms of the surgery, although the 19th century doctors who do it try to create a pedigree for it by saying, oh, it goes all the way back to the ancient world. Well, not exactly. For operations for what they think is a large one, and again, who decides who's doing the measuring, that's different from saying the clitoris full stop has to go.
Well, and this still happens today, and usually more as a punishment, right? Or as a means to prevent sort of sexual promiscuity or things of that nature.
Yes, so there's a wide range of different things which come under the overall term of genital cutting, which can be sort of operations on the labia, it can be the clitoris, they can be removing everything, they can be removing a little bit, they can be sewing things up so that a woman looks smooth rather than sort of bumpy. Um, all sorts of different things around the world. And historically, in recent years, it's been that women want to have it done because their mothers had it done. They think you won't be a sexual partner who's attractive unless you've had it done. And it takes a while to move through that sort of rhetoric. But I think it'd be fair to say now that in many communities across the world, there is a move within the community to say, we do not need to do this thing. This is likely to lead to problems, particularly when you're going to give birth, if you've sewn up everything. How are you going to do that? How are you going to ensure that women don't get infections? So there is a move against it, but there's also still people who want to have it done or who impose the idea that it's a good thing, and that maybe as long as you do it in a hygienic manner, it'll be fine. Don't use the traditional medications and materials. Use a proper surgeon, it'll be fine. It's not fine. It's not fine. And the issue of consent is a very big one. If it's done
Yes,
on young
on
girls who
children.
can't
Yeah,
give consent, yeah, exactly.
yeah.
But then, is it consent if you're doing it because you're being coerced in some way? No, it's not.
Right, even if it's a culturally normative practice, if that's all
Yes.
you've known, but there's still a part of you that fears the pain and the mutilation. I mean, I think this is a perfect example talking about female genital mutilation, this idea as you're looking back into the history and as you're sharing these stories with us, that there are these stories of abject pain and coercion and oppression and just really, really patriarchal forces that have harmed women throughout human history, but there are also examples of beauty and empowerment and excitement about the female form. And so I'm curious, how do you strike that balance in your writing?
Yes, that's hard. I've often been told that because I'm a woman, I can get away with writing this. But if
Mm,
I was saying some of these things as a man, it would come across very differently.
mm,
But because I'm in it, I can
mhm,
say it, and I think
right.
that's a helpful approach.
Yeah.
But on the subject of pain, I think one thing I'd want to put in there is the point that if you look at that story of Eve and the Garden of Eden, it ends with the expulsion of man and woman from the garden, and Eve is told, "In pain you shall give birth." And by the 19th century, when analgesia was being developed and used in childbirth, we're talking things like chloroform and ether here, drugs were being used, and there was a big question, should you use it on labor pain? And some doctors, not all, some doctors said, no, you shouldn't, because the Bible says, in pain you shall bring forth children. So the pain is essential to the process. And they tried to think of all sorts of arguments about how the pain would somehow, I don't know, help the contractions to be stronger or something, trying to give it a medical justification. But there's pain and there's pain. It's an issue where, you can say, okay, the pain won't last very much longer, you'll be fine, but sometimes you're not. And if women want pain relief, they should get pain relief.
No, exactly, and it lasts to today, and you see it both in terms of gender and in terms of racial disparity. Women, have a higher pain tolerance. Black people don't feel pain the same way that white people
Yes,
do, and we see,
yes,
like, that study after study shows that women get, like, a quarter of the pain medication that men get for the
yeah.
same difficulties, and it's infuriating.
I can tell you've been talking to Rachel Gross.
Well, I also have been talking to a gynecologist. I may or may not have to get another colposcopy at some point, a different colposcopy, a
Oh,
vaginal colposcopy.
nasty.
And I was like, I've had so many in the past the cervical cancer diagnosis that I was like, okay, so anesthesia for the vaginal colposcopy? And no, we don't use anesthesia. And I was like, what is wrong with the modern medical establishment? That is insane. I have a friend who got a vasectomy recently. The way that they took care of him for his vasectomy, which is so much less invasive. And the way that we do, oh, it's just a biopsy. Just a biopsy? You're punching
No,
out my tissue.
these things are excruciatingly painful, and to
Ugh.
pretend that they're not, it's extraordinary. This idea that somehow women's bodies don't feel pain. I mean, you've mentioned, the idea that black women somehow feel less pain than white women. There's also the idea that sort of women who've grown up in a peasant environment, they're not urban women, they're not going to feel pain. Come on, pain is pain, right? And if you want pain relief, you should have pain relief. Simple as that. And you should be offered it rather than having to ask for it. I mean,
Agreed.
I've had that thing. What is it? Is it a colposcopy? No, it's not. It's the thing where they insert a sort of probe thing and then look at the inside of your womb
Oh,
through
yeah, yeah,
it.
yeah, like, there's sometimes, like, a DNC where they'll scrape the inside and they'll dilate it, and then
Yeah, well,
there's
this
also
this
just
one is yeah, this one is done when you're conscious, and it's I was describe it as like having sex with an elephant because you look at this thing and you think you're not putting that up there, are you? And they
right.
go, oh yes, not very far, and you go, you certainly are not putting that very far. But
Yeah,
it gives you extremely good images of what's happening inside the womb. So if you're looking for tumors in the womb, it's a very helpful thing. But do they offer you pain relief? No,
right, it's
not in
like,
my
"Great, put me to
experience.
sleep for this." It's the same thing when women get IUDs inserted. I've had many
Yes.
women that have told me it was worse than childbirth to have their IUD inserted.
Wow.
Yeah, I
Wow.
mean, it's incredible. I just and I think about that line. I don't know if you ever watched the series, I think it was in Fleabag, actually,
Oh
where
yes.
where she meets with the woman at the bar, and they're talking, and she's like, "To be a woman is pain." Like, the function of our body, like, we experience so much pain on a regular basis that perhaps these very patriarchal views, I don't wanna say they come into play because of this, but it's exacerbated by the fact that pain has become so normative to so many women, and culturally, we're not allowed to complain about it, right? Culturally, we're punished if we verbalize it, so we very often suffer in silence.
I'm afraid so. Yeah. And that's been the case throughout history.
Mm, yeah, and you've seen those examples. This isn't just something that we're saying. You have documentation to
Oh
prove that this has
yes.
been the case throughout history.
Oh yes. And
Ugh.
some of the things you read in terms of descriptions of what women have had to experience as diagnostic procedures, for example. And you can see that this is excruciatingly painful, but no one mentions pain relief at all. It's just not seen as relevant. These are women. They don't, these women don't really feel pain. It's
Ugh.
very strange, isn't it? It's like we actually anesthetize animals when we operate on them, but
Mhm.
somehow not necessarily women.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh, it's heartbreaking. So I'm curious, Helen. I mean, gosh, I could talk to you for like several more hours, but I've already kept you longer than I promised you that I would. There's so much.
Oh, it's fun.
Oh, good. I'm glad. There's so much in the book. There's so many anecdotes, like you mentioned. There's so much more that we could talk about. But is there anything that you can think of, whether we're talking about a specific story or even just a takeaway that we didn't touch on that you feel is important for those who are thinking about picking up the book and reading it?
Ooh, that's a tricky one, isn't it? What have we missed out?
Right.
I'm having to think about that one. I suppose I suppose we've missed out the future. So it's where are
Mhm.
we going with all of this? What is the future for the female body?
Yeah.
And particularly for the womb, are wombs necessary? Is an interesting question to me. Because there's much
Right.
more work now being done on the idea of the artificial womb, where, of course, obviously we've got test tube babies, we've got all sorts of different interventions to create a child outside a body and then to implant a child. But do you have to implant the child back into a womb or not? Or can you grow the child somewhere else? And that, of course, does take you into other quite dodgy areas like surrogacy, where surrogacy can be something a woman wants to do for another woman, or it can, in some parts of the world, be something where women are basically coerced into it and paid not very much at all, but
Yeah.
given lots of food and healthcare in order to make for a healthy baby. But nevertheless, it's not something that is exactly a career choice. But whose womb is it? I suppose would be a question there, because surrogacy is much bigger around the world than I'd thought before I read the book. I'd known of
Yeah.
friends who'd used surrogacy, but I hadn't realized quite how big it is as a worldwide thing, and particularly between cultures, where it's
Wow.
not legal in one country, but it is in another. So that's where you go to have your surrogacy.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah, so I
fascinating.
think the future of the female body is a really important one. But obviously, the book's really about the past. But once you look at the past, you start to question the present, and you start to think differently about the potential futures.
Ugh, and now more than ever, I think especially for my listeners here in the United States, this is such a relevant, like we're facing a new Gilead here, and I just can't help but think about Atwood's. I mean, it's not her vision for the future, it's her fear for the future, but, or Octavia Butler.
But
Yeah,
it's so well
exactly.
articulated. It's so well articulated there. And of course, there we've got the basic lesson that you can't assume history is linear. It doesn't go forward and get better and better. It can go backwards. And I think we need, as women, to be very aware of that possibility, very alert to it, and to challenge it.
And I have to thank you for ensuring that you have the type of voice that sometimes I understand through social or institutional pressure is how do I put this? Very often I find in academia, and I think right now during the Trump administration, there's a resurgence of this. There's a fear, a legitimate fear of taking something that is seen as scholarly work and then having a perspective or a point of view or even a political stance and really holding that lens and being honest and I don't know, committed to that lens. I think that history, government, politics, these things are inherently human. I think that you cannot divorce them. And I appreciate the sort of honesty by which you share your perspectives, and they are informed by your scholarship.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's it really, that this is the product of over 30 years of working on the history of the female body. And I learned things I didn't know about when I was researching this book. So I hope other people too will find things that amaze them and challenge them.
Absolutely. Everybody, the book is Immaculate Forms, A History of the Female Body in 4 parts by Dr. Helen King. Helen, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.